Welcome to the inaugural episode of Catholic Authors, where we go in depth with Catholic writers on their craft, their inspiration, their experiences, their past work, their current projects, and their future plans. I invite you to like and share this episode and subscribe to this channel. My name is Rich, and it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. James L. Papandrea to the podcast. My friend Jim is the author of 25 books, his latest being Praying the Wisdom, the Divine Gateway of Lectio Divina to the Contemplative Life from Sophia Institute Press. Welcome, Jim.
Well, thanks. It's great to be here and a blessing to be on your first episode. Thanks for having me.
All right, well, thanks for being with me. I really appreciate it. Let's go ahead and jump right in. First off, tell us a bit about your background, including your spiritual journey.
Yeah, so kind of a circular journey, I guess. Baptized Catholic, raised in a Protestant denomination, ended up finding a different Protestant denomination as a young adult. And I was actually at one time an ordained deacon among the Methodists, and I still teach at the Methodist Seminary. But it was in the process of getting my PhD in studying the Church Fathers that I came back to the Catholic Church. And so that was about 25, 26 years ago, something like that. And so now my career has been all about debunking a lot of the myths about Catholicism, and especially about the early church. And as it turns out, kind of debunking the myths I was taught as a Protestant coming up, and especially as a youth and as a young adult.
Thanks for that. And what are you doing currently then? You touched on it a bit, but just tell us a little bit about what you're, I know you're an academic, you're a professor.
Yeah. So
tell us a little bit more about that. And also, you do have some side projects as well and some other interests. So you're welcome to relay all of that to us.
Yeah. So, I, like I said, I did go to seminary. I went to a Protestant seminary, ended up getting ordained in a Protestant denomination, and was a deacon, and really discerned that liturgical leadership and pastoral ministry were not my calling. And so I went back to school to get a PhD and then teach. And so it was at the same time that I also discerned a calling to come back to the Catholic Church through studying the Church Fathers. And so so I'm a lay person. I'm not ordained. I'm not a deacon at all. But I'm a professor. So my title is Professor of Church History and Historical Theology. And I am the Catholic on the faculty at the Methodist Seminary that's on the campus of Northwestern University in Illinois. It's called Garrett Seminary. I've been there 18 years or so, and I teach church history. I teach the intro to church history class that all the students have to take. So that's pretty much Jesus to Aquinas. And I teach electives in church history and other things. And so that's my day job. And of course, I write books. I'm currently the host of the Way of the Fathers podcast, which was started by our friend Mike Aquilina. He hosted that podcast for about 3 years or so, and then I took over. And so I'm doing that now. And I've off and on been a musician and doing some other things along the way. But that's what I'm up to now.
Great. I will remind everyone that all of these references we have to various resources will be in the show notes as well. I will want to make sure that you have access to all of Jim's work, his writing, as well as his music. And I've had firsthand experience listening to him talk and also hearing him play. Very talented musician and songwriter.
Thank you.
Okay, so something that I definitely am focusing on in this podcast is for those writers who, or for those who are aspiring writers, or maybe early on in their writing career. I think all writers, regardless of how far they are in their career, can always find something of interest and what other writers have to say and what their approaches are and inspirations and so on. So first question I'll ask you along those lines is, what advice would you give to aspiring authors in general, and then specifically about those writing on faith matters?
Yeah, these are great questions, and I've had the opportunity to speak to writers in the past, so I've had a chance to think about these questions. In terms of my advice to writers in general, if you want to complete a project, it's really all about the outline. It's about creating an outline first and then writing from the outline. Now, there are schools of thought out there that will say that, well, it's a matter of personal taste. Some people like to start with an outline and then write the book from an outline. Other people don't like to start with an outline and they just want to start writing and get it all on paper and edit it later. But I'm of the opinion that that's not correct. Unless you are the kind of person that can win a chess game in 4 moves, you cannot write a book without writing the outline first. Just diving in to write a book and hoping that it all comes together as you write it is the best way to ensure that you'll never finish the project. I've written over 25 books and I've never had writer's block because I always write a very detailed outline first. Now, for some people, they're going to hear that as bad news. Like it's going to feel daunting. Like, oh no, if I have to write the outline first, then I don't even want to write a book because it's not going to be fun. Well, you do have to postpone the fun a little bit because, yeah, writing the outline might not be the most fun part of being an author. But I guarantee you, writing the outline is very liberating because then when you do sit down to actually write the chapters, it's a lot more fun because you don't have to be making stuff up as you're going. And this goes for whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction. If you have a detailed outline, everything's there for you, and then you can just be creative with the notes that are already there. But if you don't have an outline, the creativity is stifled, it's blocked because you have to think of the next thing. So the more detailed the outline, the more fun you're going to have when you actually start writing the book. So that's always my biggest piece of advice. And I know there are other authors out there who are going to disagree with me, and but that is I'm adamant about that. Now, the second part of your question was, what about people who are writing books on spiritual matters in particular? And I'm going to side with the church fathers who would say that no one can write anything worthwhile if it isn't coming out of a life of prayer. And if it isn't coming out of a life lived in obedience to the teachings of the church and in conformity to the will of God as much as possible, right? Because the more that it's an ego project, or the more that an author thinks he or she is just so valuable to the church for their smarts that they don't have to live a holy life, that's a recipe for writing a book that will not outlive you, But if you want to write something that's going to last, it needs to come out of a life of prayer and holiness to the best of your ability, right? Nobody's perfect, and that's okay. That's why we have the sacrament of confession and etc. So that that would be the most general thing I would start with in terms of advice.
Yeah, actually, my next question was kind of follow up on that, about what are maybe common traps that writers have, particularly those aspiring to write. You brought out the one about just sort of diving in without a real solid plan, and having best off to have an outline. But I wonder, at least based on my own experience, once I start getting into a particular topic, I personally love to do research. And nowadays there's more, I'm sure there's more good stuff and more bad stuff than ever out there. But I guess 2 parts here. One, I can imagine that when you have your outline set, but then you start doing research and you find there's another sort of interesting angle I'm going to, maybe modify my outline, add to it, and so on. Now, I suppose the trap there is that you can end up researching forever and not getting down to, getting down to actually completing the work. So I guess first off, do you allow for relatively significant changes to your original outline? And secondly, how do you know when to stop researching?
Yeah, well, those are great questions. As far as the outline isn't done until after you've done all the research. So, in other words, you may start with an outline that's only, 8 bullet points, and they're just your table of contents and the chapter titles, or what you think will be the chapter titles. And then you start doing the research and you fill in the outline. But in order to write the book from the outline cannot be simply, chapter heading bullet points. It has to be detailed. There has to be a bullet point in the outline for pretty much every paragraph in the book. That's how detailed the outline has to be. So you're not done writing the outline until the outline is, that long. I mean, when I wrote Reading the Church Fathers, I think that book is about 400 pages long. The outline was 80 pages long, right? Now, again, I'm not saying this to make it sound daunting for people who want to write. I'm just saying you're not done with the outline until it's so detailed that the book literally writes itself, right? Now, the good news is if you're a person who loves the research part of it, the outline part is fun too, because you're doing the research, you're finding things out, and you are filling in the outline as you go. And sometimes you're rearranging things. So yeah, you're always editing the outline until one day the outline is done, and then you start writing the book. Now, how do you know when you're done? Well, sometimes you don't. And sometimes you do so much research that you find out you've really prepared 2 books or 3. That's happened to me. Trinity 101 was actually the original vision for Reading the Church Fathers would have included at least 2 other books, Trinity 101 and probably the earliest Christologies, right? But then it was just too much. And so then I had to figure out how to cut it up. I have other books where, I wrote a particular chapter that was longer than all the others. And the editor comes back to me and says, this chapter is longer than all the others. What are you going to do about that? And I say, okay, I'm going to take a chunk out of that chapter and put it at the back of the book and call it an appendix. So sometimes you have to do things like this. Other times you have to be willing to say, I learned a lot of great stuff in my research, and only 2/3 of it is actually going to go into the book. And you have to be willing to say that other 1/3 of stuff that I learned, it's nice that I learned it, but it's not going in the book, or it'll become another book some other day. Those are decisions you often can't make until you either finish the outline and you see, there's a whole tangent here that doesn't fit, or this book is going to be way too long. Or you write the book and lo and behold, the book is way too long. And so you have to say, okay, what's the, the 5th wheel in this book? Let's take it out and put it over here somewhere and do something else with it. And you often won't know until you get closer to be finished where you should have stopped with the research. But that's okay. If you did too much research, good for you. I mean, it's not a race. It is not a race to finish the book. Write the best book you can, and don't worry about going down the rabbit holes, because sometimes the rabbit holes are fun and you enjoy learning things that will never make it into the book. And that's just the way it is.
Now, you said there's not a rush, but there are sometimes deadlines, are there not? If a publisher comes to you and says, would you write this for us, and so on, and we want to have it out. Particularly, I would think, I suppose it depends on the particular topic, but there might be something that might be of something that's more timely. That is, something is going on in the church or in the world where, boy, we'd really like to have this out by Christmas or by Lent or
Sure,
something
sure,
like
yeah.
that. How does that play into what you just said?
Well, I would say it like this: the more your topic leans toward the journalistic, right, the more likely you're going to have a deadline. Current events. I mean, these guys who write these books, like when a new pope is elected and a week later a book comes out about the new pope, right? Boy, you got to respect those guys who can pull that off, right? I couldn't. The books I write, I generally, when I sign the contract for the book, the deadline is usually a year away from the signing of the contract. And then if that year comes, I'm usually pretty good about meeting the deadline. But on occasion, not so much. So if that year comes, it's just an email to the publisher saying, "Hey, I am not going to make that deadline. You okay with a couple more months or whatever?" And publishers, again, unless it's something that's perceived as super timely, publishers, if you look at their watch, they tend to have like you know, a month hand, a year hand, and a century hand. Like their projects are long term, and if you tell them you're not going to have something for them to read this month, they're secretly going to love you for lightening their load, right? So, you know,
All right. Well, the idea of having an outline in place, is this something that you started out with, or that when you first started writing, or is this something that evolved over time? And anything else that evolved over time, maybe lessons learned or anything related to your writing that,
yeah.
you know, one of those questions that's often asked is, if you could go back to to yourself when you were contemplating your first book, what lessons would you given
Mm.
your younger self that would have maybe saved you some grief in the meantime?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I mean, I've always been an outline guy. So I don't know how I would have even started any book ever without having the outline written first. If that comes from having really good composition teachers in high school, and yeah, really high school, not even college, but high school. And so I've always been an outline guy. I mean, one thing that is kind of a matter of personal preference is some people, in order to write and get anything done, they need to set aside a block of time that's like a big chunk of time. And I'm one of these people. Like, you know, on my calendar, if I need to write something, it's going to say Wednesday, I'm writing. Not Wednesday from 3 to 4, but, all day. I need a big chunk of time to get anything significant done. There are other people who can't focus that long, and, nothing wrong with them. They just need to write in smaller chunks of time. So then there are those people who say, "Well, I'm going to get up at 5:30, like an hour early every morning, and write for an hour." I could never do that. But what's important is for the writer, the author, to know, speaking to the authors now, you need to know who you are. Are you the big chunk of time person, or are you the little pieces of time along the way kind of person? Having said that, though, as a big chunk of time person, the busier you get in your life, you will need to learn the skill of, finding smaller pieces of time and being able to accomplish something in those smaller pieces of time. Um, what would I tell the Jim who is writing his first book? I would say, don't write that book, because my first book was a book about prayer, and I've been interested in prayer all my life. And so my first book, I was going to tackle how to pray, except I was in my 20s. I was too young, right? I hadn't prayed enough to write a book about how to pray. And as it turned out, um, I mean, I did write a book. I self-published it back, before people were even self-publishing books. It meant like literally hiring a printer and printing up copies, and it was not good. Um, and it became a couple of pamphlets that got published by a Catholic publishing house that later I intentionally took them out of print because they were not good. And so what I've learned is that the topic that I thought was going to be my first book really needed to be the books I'm writing late in my career now, right? So now I'm ready to write these books. I mean, you decide, read the books, you tell me, but now I'm publishing books on prayer. It was too soon then. So if you're going to write on a spiritual topic, make sure you're ready to write about the thing that you want to write about. Make sure that you are spiritually mature enough, that you've had enough years under your belt. I mean, no, I don't know. I mean, there are prodigies out there. There are saints for sure. But in general, until you're in the second half of life, you probably can't write books on, spiritual disciplines and prayer and stuff like that. So don't write the book before you're ready to write the book. Write some other book.
Okay. What other authors are you friends with, and how did they help you become a better writer? So that's actually kind of interesting question, because, I wonder. I look at your your background, what you're doing currently, being a professor, a lot of interests, family life, and so on, and all the research you do. I wonder how much opportunity you have to really sit down and just read other authors. Now, of course, in your research, you're reading tons of authors, but as far as
they're mostly dead, though.
sort of sitting down and saying, oh, my friend, or here's someone new that came out with a book, I'm just going to sort of relax with that book. It doesn't even have to be something particularly in your genre, but where you would look at this and say, wow, I picked up something from this author. I like this author's approach, and so on. So yes, I know that my initial question was, who are you friends with? I'm happy for you to, let us know about that. But how do they help you become a better writer? And how do other authors that maybe you don't know personally, but that you've picked up, help you to become a better writer as well?
Yeah. Well, if you remember back, if you went to the Easter Vigil and you sang the Litany of the Saints, you go through all the names of the church fathers, Irenaeus, Athanasius, Ambrose. Those guys are my friends, right? I mean, yes, I've read the church fathers, and I feel like I know them. I mean, obviously I have friends in my field, in the guild of patristics, or early Christian studies, and they tend to be more on the academic side. And so I've read their books when I need to do research in a topic that's more someone else's area of expertise than mine, and they read my books when they need to learn about the stuff I'm writing about. What people, I guess, maybe instinctively kind of understand, but maybe no one really says this out loud, is that there's a scale or levels of let's say how academic a book is, right? At the highest levels of academic writing, you expect a lot of footnotes on every page, and you may expect that the reader already comes to the book with a certain amount of knowledge in the field, right? And then there's, the sort of lowest levels of academic writing, and not low in a bad sense, but that they're written for the people who come to the book with no prior knowledge of the topic. They maybe don't need a lot of footnotes, and so you write it for that audience. But there's also in between, right? And so I and some others, we live in this in-between area where we want to write books that would satisfy an academic, but that are accessible for, the average person, maybe the well-read lay Catholic who is starting from scratch, maybe with the topic I'm writing about. And so I need to define all my terms. I need to explain everything, but not in a way that's talking down to anyone, and maybe not in a very academic kind of wordiness or with a lot of footnotes. And so the people I tend to, I guess the people I tend to know a lot are the people in that world. So, I mentioned Mike Aquilina, you know, um, he's a dear friend, and I've read a bunch of his books. Um, and then, again, it may be at different places on the scale of how academic their books are, but, Scott Hahn is another one, love his books. And then, some others, I mean, John Michael Talbot's books are, beautiful. And then there are others who I would like to claim them as friends, but they're the acquaintances whom I might email back and forth with, but I've never actually been in the same room with them, like Brant Petrie or somebody like that. But you see, these people are all writing well researched, um, quality books, but that are accessible to you know anyone who wants to read about the topic. Some of these folks even will write two books on the same topic, one for the academics and one for the layperson, right? Which is amazing. Um, so these are a lot of the people that I sort of gravitate to because we're kind of walking that balance beam between the academic and then the non-academic audience, and it's really rewarding when I can speak at a conference or when I encounter someone who's read one of my books, and it's just an average layperson who hasn't studied but who appreciates what I can offer them. So, yeah, I don't know if I got off on a tangent there from your questions, but those are the people's books that I read when I want to pick up a book. I do read fiction as well, um, and so but that's a whole different thing.
I was interested in what you had to say about trying to balance between academic and popular. And I know that you have titles that are more academic and more popular. I've certainly read some of them. I wonder about something that's really come on my radar, and I think a lot of radars recently in the Catholic world, maybe in the last 20 years or so, is apologetics. And I wonder, particularly with your background, having come into the Catholic faith later in life, do you how cognizant are you of that aspect of it? That is, do you try to incorporate that either subtly or more explicitly in your work? How do you think
Yeah,
about
yeah.
apologetics in what you do? And I know it may depend on the topic as well, but how do you think about apologetics in the work that you do?
Yeah, that is actually a great question. I'm glad you asked it because, on the one hand, I do not consider myself an apologist. That's not what I go after. And, there are some great apologists out there. The Catholic Answers guys, I love those guys. And, people you might see on EWTN or whatever. I mean, the church is blessed with some great apologists. I'm not one of them. Um, I don't set out to be an apologist. I don't do debate. I don't like debate. I don't consider myself good at debate. So I feel like if I were to enter into a debate, um, what if I lose the debate? And even if I have the truthful side on the debate, I could still lose the debate because I'm not a good debater. So I don't do that. I also think that apologetics and debate can too easily slip into the kinds of things that St. Paul warns about when he talks about creating controversy, you know, and creating drama and doing things just for the clicks and all that stuff. So I don't want to be involved in any of that. Having said that, though, when you do early church studies, you're always slipping into apologetics whether you want to or not. So, for example, right, I do a lot of myth busting. And so, some of my videos on YouTube will have titles like, did the early church believe in sola scriptura? Well, spoiler alert, the answer is no, they did not, right? But in explaining that, I naturally have to talk about how the doctrine of sola scriptura is an invention of the Protestant Reformation, how it has no history in the church's tradition before the 16th century, and how logically it collapses under its own weight because the doctrine of sola scriptura is meant to, sort of claim that everything has to be taught in Scripture, except the doctrine of sola scriptura is not taught in Scripture. So it's self-contradictory. So you see, before I even finish explaining the topic, I'm already doing apologetics, right? Because now I'm talking about the differences between Catholic and Protestant. I'm pointing out how the early church was like the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church of today is the closest thing we have to the early church, and that the distinctive doctrines of the Protestant denominations, well, they were a deviation from tradition, and therefore they're new. They're the sort of novelty. And so, ultimately, at the end of the day, a lot of my books do sound like apologetics, at least in some sections of the books, because you can't help it. If you're doing early Christian studies, you have to explain the early church, and that there's so many misconceptions about the early church out there, especially among Protestants, that when you start explaining what the early church was really like, you can't help but sort of debunk the Protestant myths.
Okay, my next question has to do with what do you find most difficult in the writing process? You've touched on already. You've talked about the outline, which sounds like you said the fun part is really doing the writing. The outline is maybe a little bit more challenging. Also, with your schedule, I imagine finding the time, being dedicated to finding an appropriate amount of time to hit your deadlines, or to at least keep up with the craft. But what would you say is the most difficult part of the artistic process, and how do you sort of fight your way through that difficulty?
Yeah. Well, I don't really think creating the outline is difficult. I mean, some people might not think it's fun, but it's not difficult because, when you separate the process of creating the outline from the process of writing the book, each process is liberated from having to do the other thing at the same time, right? So when you're doing the outline, you're not writing the book yet. So there's no pressure. When you're writing the book, you don't have to think of stuff to say because it's all there in the outline. So what's difficult? I mean, you did hit on one thing, which is finding the time to put the hours in to get the thing done. And then, for me, a lot of times what happens with me is I finally finish the book, I send it into the publisher, and now I'm done. In my mind, I'm done. That book is done. I'm moving on. I'm writing the next book. But then what always happens is right when I'm in the middle of trying to find the time to work on the next book, the editor from the last book comes back at me with edits and proofreading, and like, oh man, I thought I was done with this book. So that can be kind of, I mean, for me, I like to be done with one thing and move on. I'm not a multitasker. Now, here's another thing, though, that I think people need to be realistic about in terms of the hardest thing about being an author is the thing I don't do at all, which is marketing. Now, if you're fortunate enough to have publishers who do your marketing for you, whether they do a great job or a mediocre job is another question. But if you're fortunate to have publishers who do your marketing for you, then that's a luxury. I'm fortunate to have that. So to me, the way I market one book is by writing the next book. I don't get involved in marketing hardly at all. I mean, they set up interviews for me. I do interviews. This is fun. But folks who self-publish, there's nothing wrong with self-publishing. There's no shame in self-publishing. However, what you got to know is self-publishing means self-marketing. And the marketing is harder than the writing of the book because it's very difficult. Once you've written your book, now you have to market it. Now you have to get the word out. Now you have to raise awareness. It's difficult to do that and write the next book. And so that's very difficult. And for someone like me who just does not have the skills in marketing, I'm not on social media. I used to be, but I got off that and couldn't be happier. But obviously, if you're marketing a book, you got to be on social media, and you almost have to make marketing the book your full-time job. How do you write the next book if marketing the last book is your full-time job? And so people need to be realistic about that. If you love marketing, if you're very social and you're an extrovert and you find all that stuff fun and exciting, boy, blessings to you. But I'm not that guy. So I just don't. I don't do marketing. I don't like marketing. I don't want to have anything to do with it. So that's me.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic, isn't it, that there are there's never before been as many ways to get your stuff out as as there is today with all the social media, as you mentioned, and so on. And yet, because there's so much out there, it's so easy to get lost in the morass,
Yeah,
And
yeah, it really
so
is.
you're right, to be on try to be on every platform and hope to get some attention. Yeah, that's a real challenge. So for someone like you who just wants to, yeah, I want to do the work
Yeah,
of getting the books out. I can imagine where that can be a real challenge, but
yeah, and
still
it's. I
goes.
remember, back in the day when social media was new, the publishers were all excited about this because they thought they were going to be able to dump a lot of the marketing onto the authors. Oh, and there was even this window of time, and maybe some publishers are still saying this, but there was a window of time where the publishers were saying, before you even tell me about your book, tell me about your platform. I want to see that you have X number of followers, et cetera, et cetera. But the problem is, it's a catch-22, right? I mean, it's like the old saying, you can't get a job until you have experience. You can't get experience till you have a job. It's the same thing. You can't. No one on social media can market their own book until they're already famous for being a writer. But you can't become famous for being a writer until you market your books and become famous. But if you're not already famous for being an author and you go on social media and say, "Hey, I wrote a book. You all should buy it," you're going to hear the universe yawn, right? Um, so to your point, I mean, there was this moment in time when the publishers thought social media was going to be the greatest thing, and I think a lot of authors thought so too, because they thought it was going to remove the filters of the big publishing houses and the literary agents, and it was going to democratize everything, and everyone was going to be able to reach their audience, right? Except that it flooded the market. And so if I were to go on social media and say I wrote a book, the response is you and everybody else. Yeah, so it's difficult, and it's especially difficult with fiction because publishers are very afraid to publish fiction because they think it's a risk. Um, but again, another catch-22. If you don't market the book, obviously you won't sell any, right? So you got to put the money into marketing in order to raise awareness if you want to sell some. And publishers are very skittish about entering into that cycle. So
You mentioned fiction, and I know that you've written some fiction. So, uh, how did you get interested in that? I know for some authors, they will use fiction to convey in a different way. Uh, maybe someone who would never pick up a nonfiction book on a particular topic might really get engaged in fiction, and so that becomes kind of a draw there to say, hey, you have a relative you'd like to, maybe this person would you'd like to get this person, let's say in particular in faith matters, you'd like to get that person interested in the faith, but if you're going to give them a theology, not necessarily theology, but something that's nonfiction, that person's probably not going to pick it up, maybe not that much of a reader, but a person can really get engaged maybe in something that's fictional. Was that your motivation for doing fiction? Is it just that you're interested in that particular area? You had something particular to say, or whatever the case might be. Why did you do some fiction work, and do you plan on continuing to do that?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I do have one of my fiction pieces is what we call kind of didactic fiction. It's fiction meant to teach. It's called A Week in the Life of Rome, and I heard at the time that University Press was doing this A Week in the Life series, and they had a week in the life of a Roman centurion, a week in the life of a slave, a week in the life in Corinth, and so they're all set in the first century. So they're trying to teach, the history of the early church and the New Testament era through fiction. And so I went to them and I said, "Well, you have to let me write A Week in the Life of Rome." I talked him into it. I did write the book, and it's doing pretty well. It's been translated into other languages. I did the audio book for it. I got to read it. So I love doing that, but that really wasn't my motivation for getting into fiction. My motivation for writing fiction was it's fun. It's more fun than writing nonfiction. What I didn't realize when I started is that it's also harder than writing nonfiction. It's harder to write good fiction. Um, so I will definitely keep doing it. Like I said, it's very difficult to get fiction published. So that's the thing that slows down the process, is finding a publisher. But I when I envision my retirement, I'm going to get to the point where I've said everything I wanted to say in the sort of, you know nonfiction world of, early Christianity, etc. And probably in retirement, I will only write fiction if I can get it published. I'm hesitant to go down the road of self-publishing, but who knows? Maybe I will someday. But no, it's a lot of fun. I love stories. I love characters. I've always loved movies and reading fiction, and the way stories work. And so I wanted to be in on that. And as a historian, I've also always loved historical fiction and time travel stories, or any, what we would call a fish out of water story. The 21st century guy who gets dumped into the 16th century. That's, fish out of water. That's a time travel story, you know, or right, vice versa, or whatever it is. But I just love these fish out of water stories, and the stories of somebody dropped into a time that's not their own, and how they navigate that, and how it highlights the differences. Um, so yeah, so that's how I got into it. I thought I want to write stories.
Um, Getting back to the writing process, do you show anyone your work in progress? So do you pass it by a friend, another author, family member, to kind of just in a way for you to step away from it? I imagine, once you're in the process, you're very close to it. You don't necessarily see, oh, maybe this could be done better, or this is superfluous, or there's something missing here, like assumptions that you make in the writing that someone coming fresh to it said, well, how did you get from point A to point B? How much, if any, of that do you do?
I almost never. I usually finish the book, and then I expect that the editors at the publishing house are going to be the people who are going to do that. So sometimes the editor comes back to me and says, this whole paragraph seems like you don't need it, or I feel like, you need to help me get from connect the dots here, or whatever it is. And of course they find the typos and stuff too. But I don't generally ask people to do that. Um, Now, a part of it is I know that once the book is coming out, I'm going to be asking friends or, other authors to read it, to write maybe a blurb on the back cover or something. So that's coming down the road. But no, I don't have like beta readers or anything. I just if I when I'm too close to it, then I just put it away for a while. And often I don't even have to plan to do that, because it just so happens that, at some point in the process, I have a vacation. I go on vacation. I don't work on it for 2 weeks, or I'm leading a pilgrimage, and I'm just not going to look at it for 2 or 3 weeks or whatever. And so then I come back to it, and it's like I'm reading it. It's like I'm reading it for the first time, like I didn't even write it, like somebody else wrote it. And so for the most part, I can kind of just, with that kind of stepping back, I can approach it again pretty objectively. But I mean, one of the realities is that when you're an expert on something, the only other people who can critique it are other people who are experts on that same thing. But even within the guild, even within the societies of early Christian studies, et cetera, that I have been going to the conferences all my career, and I've made some dear friends there. We don't generally say, here's a book I'm working on, will you read it for me? Because nobody has the time for that. And so ironically, or for good or for ill, I mean, when the book is done, or when I think the book is done, and then the editor reads it, sometimes what's happening is you've got the guy with the PhD wrote the book. The person who doesn't have the PhD is now critiquing it. And I have to push back on, 2/3 of all the critiques and say, no, what I said was right. You're wrong. Sorry. And that's what ends up happening a lot. But what are you going to do?
I imagine over time too, once now you're quite well established. You've been with different publishers, I know, but you're quite well established. So I would think that over time, particularly if someone comes to you, even if you go to them, I suppose, they're going to check you out and say, well, yeah, we know this guy is pretty, we know what he's coming up with. I don't imagine that is, they more than likely know what they're getting. So I don't imagine that there's going to be a lot of, a lot of questioning as to your approach and things like that. Would you say that that's the case? That once you're more well established, you pretty much have free reign? Yes, you talked about typos, and there can be little gaps here and there, but I would think generally speaking, you're not going to get. I don't imagine you're going to get a manuscript back that's every page has 10 notes on it about what you need to do differently.
I mean, it depends on the publisher. There are some publishers that let me say whatever I want, and I like them. There are other publishers where, an editor gets his or her hands on it, and they feel like they got to put their fingerprints on every page. Even not to the point of critiquing what I wrote as if I said something wrong or anything like that, but just rearranging my words and changing. And even with that, sometimes I have to push back on that and say, well, I said it this way for a very precise reason. And, therefore it needs to be said that way. So it just depends on the publisher. And there's some publishers that I won't work with anymore after, if there's too much of that. I'm just like, I don't need you, So, but to your point, earlier in my career, you have to put up with more of that because you haven't kind of proven yourself,
Yeah, I recall an editor friend of mine saying, well, now this is probably has to do with newer writers, but I recall him relaying a story one time. He said, this guy submitted something to me, and when I sent it back to him, he said, that doesn't sound like me at all. And my editor friend says, you're welcome. Okay, so there's a little bit of sarcasm in there, but so editors have important work to do. But as you say, once you become more well established and kind of, like, this is your style, I would think that if it's not a fit for that particular publisher, then as you say, there's gonna be a breakup there, or maybe they're not even to work with you.
It's funny. Well, I have actually said that to editors, like, okay, but this isn't the way I would say it. No one's ever said you're welcome back to me. Maybe they were thinking it, but yeah, you're right. I mean, when you've been doing it a long enough time, you have your own style, and there are certain ways, depending on what books they've read, they want to hear things a certain way, and maybe I don't say it that way, and so you know, it depends. The publisher needs to be okay with that, you know. But I mean that, you know, the thing about publishing in the Catholic world is that the publishers generally tend to be pretty accessible. Like they're run by nice people who are not mean to you or, you know, standoffish. And if you have something worth publishing, you can get it to the right people usually, you know.
Now, so we've discussed feedback here, at least feedback from your publishers, and maybe uh, this my next question won't be such an impact to you since you're off of social media, which definitely can be a blessing. But what about criticism? Is this something that you um, uh, that troubles you at all? Do you not pay attention to it, or maybe you don't even look at it whatsoever? But what about criticism?
Yeah.
Constructive
I
criticism, or just, you know, maybe nasty criticism?
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, I mean, there's a certain element of criticism that's expected when you do what I do. So when I debunk, you know, some of the myths of the Protestant world, I'm going to get pushback from Protestants. But like I said, you know, I don't enter into debate. It is what it is. I don't read my own reviews because I'm the kind of person that would lose sleep over that. Or I would feel like I would have to respond to every negative comment. So even like on Amazon, I don't go through and read my reviews. My books, as far as I know, are all at least 4 stars. You know, so they're like 4.5, 4.25 stars in terms of the average aggregate review. So when I see that, I'm like, it's 4 or more. I'm not going to worry about it. Now every once in a while, not recently, but in my career, maybe a couple of times, someone has said to me, "Oh, you need to see this review," and then I'll look at it and then maybe respond to it. But that's super rare. I generally don't read the reviews um, because it would just take up too much of my sort of mental and emotional headspace, you know. And so I usually just ignore that stuff. And I figure if there's anything really bad, someone will bring it to my attention. But, you know, mostly it's just bad reviews mean I don't agree with you. And, you know, if someone who also had a PhD in my field didn't agree with me, they'd email me. They wouldn't, you know, leave a review on my book. So I'll have a conversation with them. But for the most part, it's, you know, I don't agree with you. Well, okay, but I did the research. So, you know, what am I going to do? So,
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up. Sometimes when I discover a book that I might be interested in, I will check out the reviews on Amazon or on Goodreads, and I come to that same conclusion. This person apparently didn't write the book that you wanted, but why don't you if you're going to review a book, review it on the author's terms. And if the person said, you know, if the author says this is an introduction to some topic, and it's not an introduction, it assumes way too much, that's a fair critique. But
yeah,
right. If it's something that, well, I didn't like it because, as you say, either I don't agree with it or I was looking for something else, well, then probably you should go to something else. So I can totally understand
that's right. And, you know, that
point.
it works that way.
Yeah.
Even in academic journals, even among academics, in the back of the journals where they have reviews of academic books that are coming out, I've done a few of those when I've been asked to, but I generally don't, because this is the same thing. It's like, you know, here, even an academic review of a textbook is the person saying, you know, basically they're saying, well, I'm bummed that I didn't get to write that book. I'm sorry that the publisher didn't come to me to write this, but if they had, here's the book I would have written, and you didn't write the book I would have written. You know, it's like, okay. So yeah, I mean, it is what it is.
Yeah, I've done a few book reviews in my time, and something I always appreciate that an author does is that in the introduction or the foreword or something saying, this is what I'm trying to accomplish here. And then when I do the review, I actually quote the author. This is what the author tried to accomplish, and here on my reading, this is how well
Yeah, yeah,
or not
yeah.
so well the author accomplished that. So I think that's important for authors too, to just say, what are you trying to do here? One of my favorite podcasters, when he interviews an author, his first question always is, "What's your book about?" Which that's really a great question if you're focusing on a specific book, because then you let the author say in his or her own terms, "Hey, this is what I set out to accomplish, and this is how I went about doing it." And then you can evaluate it from there.
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so all that being said, then what does literary success look like to you? So you either had an inspiration to do a book or a publisher approached you about it, and it's done, it's out there in the market now, and X amount of time has passed. And what does literary success look like to you?
Well, that is a great question because I think a lot of people who want to be authors have an unrealistic sense of what an author's life is. A lot of people, in fact, I think they've done polls where, they've asked questions like, what occupation do you think has the greatest lifestyle? And a lot of times author pops up near the top because people think that authors just, write and research or just make up stories and write them, and that's their whole job. But the reality is that the number of people who can make a full-time living as an author is, it's like the number of people who can make a full-time living as a baseball player or the number of people who can make a full-time living as a painter. It's a small minority of people who love to paint or who love to play baseball. So I'm fortunate that I'm able to publish my books and I get royalties on my books. But all my royalties combined do not make a full-time salary, right? I have a day job as a professor. That's my full-time salary. So to ask, so what is literary success? Well, there's a certain satisfaction to having written the book, completed it, gone through the whole process, and see it in print. There it is in the bookstore. I mean, yeah, there it is on Amazon. But some of the greatest moments I've had in my career is when I walk into the bookstore in the Vatican and my book's on sale, or I walk into the bookstore at the shrine in Washington D.C. and my book is there. Um, so there's that. As a professor, it's also pretty rewarding when I can use my book as the textbook for a course. And it's not just about making my students buy my books, which they do, but again, the royalty from that is negligible. It's about having created in one package, a kind of course that the students will go through, or maybe they need a couple of books for a course. But the point is that now I don't have to lecture at them because the lectures are all in the book. Um, and sometimes I get invited to speak at conferences where people will have read my book or they'll buy my book later and read it, and so I get to meet these regular folks who are learning things from my books. But that's really what it's about, I think.
Yeah, I can imagine it's rewarding because you are out there doing pilgrimages and talks and so on. That when someone comes up and says, "Hey, this book really made a difference to me. I learned something from it. I don't see things the same way as I did before. Thank you." And there's a certain reward in that as well. And I think even here again for aspiring authors or those that may be a little frustrated about maybe early on not getting the word out or not having a lot of sales, sometimes it's just, hey, who's that one person out there that
Yeah.
whose life may have been changed or may have grown in their faith or something to that effect because of the work that the author has done. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really true. I mean, if you want to be an author, you have to want to do it because you love writing or you love having written, you love finishing a book. Um, Not because you think you're going to make a living off of it, because you're probably not. And I mean, I always say, sales is not the report card of the author. sales is the report card of the marketing department of the publisher. So if a book doesn't sell well, that's on the marketing department. However, if you self-publish, you are the marketing department. So now you've got, two full-time jobs. So that's difficult. But yeah, I mean, you're probably not going to sell enough books to change your lifestyle. So you need to do it because you love to do it.
After finishing a book, do you immediately start something new, or do you take a breather for a while? And
Yeah, it's a great question.
have you now you're a professor, so do you take sabbaticals from time to time? How does it sort of fit into the rest of your life? How does your writing fit into the rest of your
Yeah.
life?
Well, ideally, I would take a break between writing projects. But the way things work, often by the time you finish one book, you've already kind of started the next one, even if it's just in terms of starting to map out the outline and stuff like that. And so I don't always have the luxury of taking a nice break between projects. Sometimes I have multiple projects going on at once, which I don't like to do because, as I said, I don't like to multitask. But there are times when I've got overlapping projects. So I'm working on a couple of things at a time. So I finish one and then the next one's half done or something. The sabbatical is something that's part of the day job, right? So it depends on, for those who are professors, it depends on the institution they work for. Some people have sabbaticals, some people don't. Of those who have sabbaticals, some people need to get a grant to supply their salary. So there are some institutions that don't, they'll give you a sabbatical, but they're not going to pay you while you're on sabbatical. So you need to find that money somewhere else. I'm fortunate that I teach at a school where we do have paid sabbaticals. In fact, I'm on sabbatical now through the fall semester, and so I'll be using this sabbatical time to hopefully finish the book project that I'm working on now. But then it'll be several years before I get another sabbatical.
Before I ask you to share, if you wish, on this next project, I know that your most recent book is called Praying the Wisdom. It's on Lectio Divina. Would you like to, and that is also a part of a series of books that you've written, the third in a series. Is that series completed? You can relay that. But I'd be happy to have you share a little bit about that, what inspired you to write this series on prayer specifically, and is there any more coming from, are there any more books coming from that series? And is there anything else in your catalog that you'd particularly like to highlight? You're certainly an expert in the early church and the early church fathers, but anything you would like to tell us about your most recent project that you've completed, as well as anything in the past you'd like to share, I'd be happy to have you do that now.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, like I said, my whole career has been about, teaching people what early Christianity was like. What was it like for the early Christians in the time of the church fathers? And so I wrote reading scripture like the early church, right? How did the church fathers interpret scripture? But as I also said, I've always been interested in prayer. And so, those early projects aside, now I'm coming full circle to the point where I'm starting to think, well, okay, if it's important how the early Christians practiced their faith, I started wondering, what was the devotional life of the early Christian lay people like? In other words, outside of Mass, how did people pray? What did their prayer lives look like? And so I wrote Praying Like the Early Church, which has gotten a lot of great feedback. People seem to like that book. And so what I'm doing there is I'm trying to say, well, if this is what the prayer life of the early Christians was like, what if we were to lean into that? And what if we were to take our prayer lives to the next level? And as it turns out, the good news is that taking your prayer life to the next level does not mean making it more complicated. it actually means simplifying. And so, I mean, we could talk about that more, but so then after I wrote Praying Like the Early Church, I wrote these two companion volumes, Praying the Psalms and Praying the Wisdom, where I took prayers from Scripture and I I translate them myself, so that you can pray them. So praying the Psalms it's excerpts from the Psalms. It's those parts of the Psalms where the psalmist is speaking directly to God, and it's translated and printed in a way where you can read the words off the page and pray them to God yourself and make them your own. And so after I did that, then I wrote Praying the Wisdom, which is all the other prayers in the Bible, and also some prayers from some other holy writings from the Jewish world and the ancient church that aren't in the Bible, but that were considered holy writings. And so between those two books, it's pretty much all the prayers in the Bible and then some. And again, translated for 21st century English, and in a way that allows the reader to pray these prayers, sort of put their own situation into the prayers. And it's really amazing just how much there is something in those ancient prayers for any situation you might find yourself in. And so these are meant to be, they're standalone books. People can, just take them as they are. But they're also meant to be companion volumes to Praying Like the Early Church and the next one that's coming out. So they have like blank pages in them for journaling. And, the idea is you can write in them. And, if the prayer is for there's a prayer for a person who's far away that comes out of Paul's letters. If the prayer says him, you can scratch it off and write her because you're thinking of a woman who's far away that you want to pray for, or you can change it and make it your own. If the prayer says pray for me and you want to write in pray for us and you're thinking of your whole family, you can do that. So you can kind of journal and write in these books without then defacing your Bible, right? And so the next one, the book that I'm working on now that will be out hopefully next year, is Praying Like the Mystics. And so this is where I take it to another level yet, and we go into contemplative prayer. It's not how to be a mystic, but how to be a contemplative, how to live the contemplative life and practice contemplative prayer. And that book is taking at least twice as long as any other book I've ever written, because I am practicing contemplative prayer while I'm writing it. And so that's a good example of a book that the original 1-year deadline was last January. And I told them I need another whole year at least to write this book. So that's what I'm working on now.
Well, thanks for all that. We'll have to look forward to that. What would you like to leave us with?
Well, I think that it matters what early Christianity is like. Pretty much everything I do is based on that assumption. But maybe I shouldn't just assume that everyone agrees with that. But I want to convince people that it does matter how the early Christians practiced their faith, what they believed, what the church fathers taught them. Because, the early church is the time in our church's history that, not only is it closest in time to Jesus and the apostles, but it's also that time in the church's history when the church was clarifying doctrine like the Trinity, and the church was defining things like what is a church. And so during those, let's say the first 500 years or so of the church, it's extremely important to get back at that, to get and take a hard look at that time in the church's history. Not that we'll do everything the way they did necessarily, but it matters. It's important to know what they believed and how they practiced their faith. And the good news for Catholics is there is this great, beautiful consistency. We live in this unbroken chain all the way back to the early church, but it's still important to to look at the early church and study it. And this is why, I want to write books like reading scripture like the early church, praying like the early church, or the original church, right? It's important because it matters what the early church was like. And I think every Catholic should at least have a better awareness of this.
All right, well, thank you so much, Jim, for joining me. Check out the show notes for links to the various websites, books, and other resources mentioned in this episode or related to it. And please remember to like and share this episode and subscribe to this channel. Until next time, God bless.